Okay, I think we can just start, and if people are still joining us, they can do so, of course. So welcome back to the second session. Welcome back, or welcome for anyone who's just joining us now. For the second session of our event, Children and Artificial Intelligence, Risks, Opportunities, and the Future. So in this session, we will particularly focus on the future of online safety, and I will start by a brief introduction before we then move on to listening to our speakers' short presentations, and then we will also have plenty of time for questions. First, I want to say a few things about housekeeping, for anyone who's already been here for the first session, this will not be new to you, so apologies for being a bit repetitive, but just in order to make sure for anyone who's new, we will be recording the event. So this you should have already received a notice. So basically, if you keep your camera off and keep yourself muted, is the best way to, if you don't want to be seen in the recording will later on be made available on the CRASSH website. And also on the YouTube channel of CRASSH. If you want to ask a question, which you are, of course, more than welcome to do, you can either type it in the chat, either publicly, or also if you don't want anybody or everybody to read the question, you can also just send it to me or Shauna. Or you can also use the raise hand function if you want to personally ask the question. We also have live captions enabled for this event. So if you want to enable those, you can find the button for that in the bar at the top, at the bottom level of your screen. So, and also finally, before we start, you will be probably receiving an email from Eventbrite after this event and be asked to complete a questionnaire about this event, and we would be very grateful, of course, if you could complete this questionnaire and give us some feedback on the event. So starting off, I just want to briefly introduce the project again that is responsible for organizing this event. We are a team of interdisciplinary researchers. The project is called Giving Voice to Digital Democracies, and we are part of the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities based here at the University of Cambridge. As I said, we are a team of interdisciplinary researchers from fields like linguistics, computational linguistics, computer science and engineering. And we are specifically interested in the ethical and social implications of language-based artificially intelligent systems. So this is the focus of our research. And I want to briefly just give you an idea of one of the main research areas that we have been looking at in the past, I would say 2 years, which has been online hate speech, online multimodal hate speech as well, because this will kind of transition ideally to the topic of this session in part, because it is a major concern for online safety, particularly for children. As the Council of Europe has defined it, it is one of the biggest threats currently to our democratic societies and human rights. And we can see from the numbers here taken from a relatively recent studies that up to 40% of people, at least in the UK, say that they have witnessed harmful content. And of course, if we consider that children are the most, almost the most confident when using modern technology, you can imagine how high numbers are amongst children and young people. And we have also seen an increasing amount of research that shows that witnessing or experiencing online hate speech can have serious offline effects as well, like sparking actual real-life violence and leaving victims traumatizing with serious psychological consequences. So we've been looking at this area in particular, and increasingly also the problem of multimodal hate speech, which, as you all might know, communication, especially on the internet, is increasingly or becoming increasingly multimodal, and this is no exception when it comes to harmful content and hate speech in particular. So what we've been doing or suggesting in particular as a kind of solution or an approach to preventing people or giving a bit more protection to people online is what we have termed quarantining online hate speech. So here we published this in 2020, and we specifically proposed an approach that kind of intersects or finds a balance between allowing any kind of speech and restricting or censoring speech. So in this case, any kind of potentially offensive post will be put in a quarantine automatically, which is similar to antivirus software that we use on our laptops and our computers and our phones already. So a user will receive a prompt, a warning, and they can decide whether or not they want to see a message, or also whether or not they want to post a message that might be classified by a system as potentially dangerous or hateful. And so you can see we actually developed an application of this together with an engineering student, and you can see a screenshot here of the application in practice, basically, where a user receives a warning about a post that could potentially be hateful, and the system also gives a kind of indication via this so-called hateometer or hatometer as to how concerned it is or how certain it is that this post is potentially harmful. And so the user can decide for themselves whether they want to proceed or not. I have included a short video of the application in use. So if you just want to, oh, no, that's not correct. Here we go. So here you can just see basically how the application would work in practice. So here you can actually set, first of all, a confidence threshold. So how certain do you want the system to be? So this first part would be, it gives you an idea of posts that you might see on social media platforms and how potentially dangerous they could be. And then in the second part, you will see that the system would also give out a warning about a post that the author or the user is composing themselves. It kind of would work both ways. Yes, so this was just to give you a very brief insight of this application that we've been developing and working on. And I wanted to just introduce this because, of course, it's relevant in relation or in the context of just the wider public, but also specifically with regard to young people, because we probably all are familiar with this, that children and particularly adolescents, teenagers, are particularly exposed to harmful content online. And we've seen studies, plenty of studies by now, that look at bullying and harassment and how that can actually seriously put children at risk and adolescents at risk in their mental health and well-being. And there are also studies that indicate that this kind of, or any kind of toxic stress, as Johnson et al. Have termed it, can lead to serious long-term effects, and that furthermore, also the exposure to online harmful content, the constant exposure to hate speech can lead to an increased desensitization of people and young people. And of course, we're still living in the times of a pandemic, and we have seen, thanks to numerous studies, I've just quoted one study from 2020 here, that there has been an increase in online toxicity and cyberbullying amongst children. And this one study here found a 70% increase in hate between kids and teens during online chats, kind of starting off with the onset of the pandemic and then continuously increasing. And so I wanted to use this example as kind of to set the scene for this second session today, to talk about how to keep children safe in the context of online harms, and also what can we do in the future to maybe improve the situation? What kind of considerations are important for us to consider as researchers, as practitioners in the future, and also what role does technology play, and how can it actually maybe be beneficial in order to make the internet or the online world a safer place for children and young people. And so this leads me basically to this second session, and we will start by very short 10-minute presentations or statements by each of our speakers. So starting with Gordon Harold, Dan Sexton, and Fred Langford. And I will then invite also the participants from the first session to join if they are still around and if they are interested and maybe want to comment on any of the presentations given by the speakers in this session. And then I will open the session for anyone in the audience who would like to ask questions. So as said earlier, please feel free to put your question in the chat box or raise your hand. And I will now stop sharing my screen and introduce our first speaker, Professor Gordon Harold, who is Professor of the Psychology of Education and Mental Health here at the University of Cambridge. And his research examines the factors that either positively or negatively affect young people's mental health and development. And as part of his project, the eNurture network, he has also looked at how the digital work shapes mental health outcomes for children and young people, and how we can develop effective guidance for parents, teachers, and other professionals that takes advantage of its positive features while limiting potentially damaging effects. So the floor is yours.
Stephanie, thank you for that brilliant presentation. You don't need me to give the presentation, it was that good. You've just summarized the whole talk, so that's fantastic, so well done. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you today. So my name is Gordon Harold. I'm Professor of the Psychology of Education and Mental Health at the University, as Stephanie says. I'm also Director of what's called a UKRI, Research and Innovation Mental Health Research Network, titled the Nurture Network or eNurture. And the focus of this research network is to highlight through research how we support children and young people's mental health in a digital world. And that's what I'll focus on for a very, very brief 10 minutes. And I look forward to addressing any questions following that. So set the scene. Particularly in the topic of mental health, let me just give you a few statistics. So presently, and these numbers are changing all the time, particularly in the pandemic context, 1 in 5 children and young people in the United Kingdom report or experience serious mental health problems. So problems such as depression, anxiety, conduct problems, substance misuse, psychosis, self-harm, homelessness, and suicidality are recognized as factors that young people experience, and that these problems, particularly depression, anxiety, self-harm, and other such problems, are on the increase, beyond just more reporting or awareness, that are actually on the increase in terms of prevalence rates across all ages, young children, adolescents, and early adulthood. By 2030, it's estimated that depression will be one of the leading causes globally of mortality and morbidity, costing approximately $16 trillion globally. Again, an estimate that was generated pre-pandemic, so likely significantly higher as a result of the pandemic. And importantly, it's now recognized, identified that 75% of serious psychiatric illness in adulthood is in place before the age of 18 years. So if we are to understand mental illness across the lifespan, particularly factors that affect early adulthood or later life, and we are not focusing on childhood and adolescence, we're missing out on a key window through which these problems and their causes can be better understood. So what I'm going to try to do is give you a very quick summary. If you wanted a 5-minute summary of factors that influence child development, this is it. It's going to be very, very quick. Very important to separate out mental health from mental illness. They are not synonymous terms. Regularly, people will say to me, can you come and give a presentation on mental health? And I say, so we want to focus on doing well. People say, no, not doing well. So, well, then we need to focus on mental illness or poor mental health or various other terms that capture the range of conditions that are associated with mental disorder. How do we explain child development, both positive and deviations from positive mental ill health? Fundamental list of factors. Genetic factors affect variation in children's mental health and development. Prenatal factors affect variation in children, adolescents, and young people's mental health and development. Family factors, classically parenting processes, postnatal factors in people's development. School and peer-related dynamics affect young people's mental health and development. These relationships expand across the lifespan again, so particularly peer friendships are a particularly important area of understanding impacts on children's mental health and development. More recently, a term known as epigenetics, how environmental factors actually work with genetic systems or risk factors, risk processes to activate gene systems, to understand how, therefore, the interplay between the two operates. These factors all work together in a quite complex way. So just to add further difficulty to everything, none of these tend to operate in isolation, while we have systems of influences understanding children's normal or typical and atypical development. I want to focus on 3 areas. So I'm a developmental psychologist in terms of my core training. And when I was a student a long, long time ago now, I started when I was about 5, obviously because I'm very young still. We spoke about the world of nature versus nurture. And the 2 worlds never really spoke to each other. We now know that actually nature and nurture work together very closely. But the areas that I focused on in my early studies was family processes, school-related processes, and peer-related processes. And they were the big so-called social environmental influences on children's mental health and development. So I want to give you a real story. I won't go into too much detail for obvious reasons, but a few years ago, I was in a room with a young person, a 12-year-old young person, whose parents were separating. And the social worker was very concerned that the young person in the room was compulsively using their mobile phone, to quote the actual concern. In conversation with the young person, that was an offline conversation. It was outside of the formal assessment, just an informal conversation. The young person declared that without their phone, they would engage in significant harm. And the reason that they were engaging so consistently with the phone was that their father was suffering from very serious mental health disorder, specifically bipolar disorder. And this young person was very concerned about the welfare of their father. And through a WhatsApp group, this young person was able to be reassured that their father was okay. Without the phone and access to WhatsApp, this young person would have been experiencing even greater distress, and thus was proposing to engage in very severe behavior, self-harm and suicidality specifically. So it was in that conversation that I was confronted with the challenge that actually this mobile phone device and online world is a protective factor, is a positive in this young person's world, family relationship world. And I went back to my office, took a developmental textbook out and said, again, if we look at the digital world, where does it land in terms of training for that social worker, for other people that work with young people in risk contexts? If you look at a developmental textbook and you look at environmental influences, families, schools, and peers, to find digital, you have to go into media. At least then in that textbook, you had to go into media. And I was struck that actually, as a professional, but also as a parent, I knew very little about the digital world as it influenced parenting, my understanding of my own children's peer relationships, their school world. This is all pre-pandemic. And actually, if I went for evidence-based resources, I couldn't find too much to help me understand how does the digital world influence young people's mental health and development positively and not positively. And it was that question that led to, and that conversation, that led to a proposal to set up a new research project called the Nurture Network, to specifically try to not just understand digital world influences on children's mental health and development, but specifically, how does the digital world influence family life, peer relationships, school-based experiences, and how do we provide evidence-based resources for parents and other adults to better understand the digital world and its influences on children. And now when we talk about nurture environments, we need to move beyond just family, just peer, just school, to recognize that there's a fourth pillar in terms of digital influence, in terms of environmental influences, which is the digital world. And with all additional three traditional areas, family, school, peer, they no longer operate in the way that I would have experienced them as a young person. They operate relative to and around and infused by the digital world. How do we inform our understanding of those particular influences? If I look up evidence, this is about 5 or 6 years or so before this network was set up. You can read in the news questions about the online world. Adults can't keep up with technology, trying to better understand technology. Another story, worry less about screen use. Parents told it's all fine. So where do you go for information to help you understand how to help a child of a given age, stage of development, and the world that is pervasive now, which is the digital world? Very little evidence-based, robust evidence-based resource going back to 2018, 2019. So we were fortunate, myself and colleagues were fortunate to be awarded funding for a 5-year project called eNurture. The E is obviously digital and nurture is obviously focusing on the environment. That took me weeks to come up with. Sitting in a coffee shop, it finally dawned on me in conversation with my then, how old was he? My then 12-year-old son, in talking about the digital world. What are we trying to do? Bottom line, I can't read on my screen now. How do we equip parents, teachers, practitioners, and other professionals, as well as young people themselves, with knowledge, evidence-based knowledge that helps us better understand how the digital world influences children's mental health and development, positively and not so positively? It won't surprise you to hear that people who know most about the digital world are young people themselves. When talking to a young person about what's the most important factor in helping that young person better understand the risks of the online world and digital exposure, her answer was, a 6-year-old, her answer was, tell my mum to turn her phone off first over dinner. Now, I'm a parent, and when I was asked that question, my answer was, that's a very, very good point, and something I'm going to take home with me myself this evening. So before we start talking to young people about their world and how to help them, we need to understand actually what they see, what they experience, and what they're exposed to, and how do we educate adults particularly to understand that. That's what eNurture is. eNurture is a resource that is a project whereby, a program of research whereby we actually fund others to do research on this topic, and their findings are then collated as part of this overall resource accessible to various communities of interest. You can go onto the webpage and you'll find a whole load of fantastic resources, particularly through the pandemic period, resources to support parents, schools, others, and young people themselves in the mental health area. But it's a library of evidence-based resources to answer the question which started off right from the outset: how do we understand digital world influence on young people and help adults better understand such influences? There's the webpage. I'll finish by saying, with 3 seconds haven't gone over, this is part of an AI event. I would go back to where this project started, digital world. How do we educate adults and others to better understand not just the risks, but the opportunities and positives through both digital and AI interface, through education, therefore, moving us away from just a risk focus to actually harnessing positives and strengths, and how best to avoid risk, because there clearly are risks relative to exposure and other such factors. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gordon, for this very interesting and also perfectly timed presentation. And I like the idea. I think it's really important what you said about kind of we have to understand our own behaviors as adults first before we start, or in order to really think about how to make better decisions for our children. I want to move on now to our second speaker, Dan Sexton. He is Chief Technology Officer at the Internet Watch Foundation, which is a registered charity based in Cambridge and which focuses on finding and removing any content depicting the sexual abuse of children online. And Dan's role involves securing highly sensitive data and ensuring that higher standards of work and data quality are adhered to when creating data sets. He has over 20 years of experience in information technology, working across a range of environments, including local government, the academic sector and in commercial software development. So we're very excited to hear from you, Dan.
Hi, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen as well. And I'll run through a few slides. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. Okay, so thank you for the introduction. Yes, I'm Chief Technology Officer at the Internet Watch Foundation, also based in Cambridge. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do at the Internet Watch Foundation, and of the sort of topic of the workshop today. I'm afraid the area that we really work in is very much the harms, and not just from the future, but really from the present as well. But hopefully there are some opportunities there, which I hope we'll be able to cover as well. So IWF is a non-profit. We've been around for 25 years. Fundamentally, we are there to find, assess, and remove images and videos that contain the sexual abuse of children. We work globally. We're in 50 different countries, can report to us. We have 170 of the global technology companies that fund our work and make up our members. And our vision is an internet free of child sexual abuse and a safe place for children and adults to use around the world. I would go into the online harm part, child sexual abuse material, and what child sexual abuse material is. CSAM, as it's generally called, it was at one point a solved problem. So before the internet, child sexual abuse material was something that was generated, shared by mail or in person by small groups of people. It was very much a high risk and low availability of content, and law enforcement got very effective at targeting and shutting down that distribution in the years in the past. For example, in 1980, a successful CSAM magazine sold 800 copies in a year. In 2000, 20 years later, a single company, an internet company, was found to have more than 2.25 million registered customers. And again, 20 years later, we see things like single websites hosting CSAM receiving 6.5 million views in a single month. So it's gone from a problem that was solved, and with the birth of the internet, it has become a massive problem, and one that nobody could have predicted, I think, at the time. What we've seen is the internet has enabled high availability with low risk. That's then in turn led to greater demand for consumption and generation, and I want to talk a little bit about that. So the IWF and our work, I just have a few headlines I'm going to provide for sort of context of what we're seeing. We processed 360,000 reports last year, of which 250,000 contained child sexual abuse imagery. That's a 66% increase from the year before. 72% of that is self-generated. I'm going to talk a bit about self-generated, I think, as it's very relevant to the topic at hand. Very little of that is UK hosted, and we found that 11 to 13-year-olds were the most seen group, and 7 to 10-year-olds the largest group after that. So some pretty horrific figures there, I'm afraid. So self-generated child sexual abuse, we're talking about images and videos which were generated by the child. So they wouldn't necessarily have been, they may have been coerced into generating imagery, but they would have been generated based on using a webcam or a smartphone or something the child themselves. So that's where there isn't another person in the room, where they are creating the material with their own internet-enabled tools. And the important thing here with self-generated, the prevalence of self-generation, you can see that a study in 2015 by our colleagues, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the US, found that 60% of offenders engaged in online grooming did so with the sole purpose of encouraging those children to generate CSAM. So CSAM is not just a symptom of abuse, it is increasingly the goal of abusers. It's what people are, when they're going to groom or to coerce children, is to get them to create CSAM and for the production and consumption of CSAM. We saw a massive increase in self-generated abuse. A lot of the time it will be in bedrooms and home settings. So this is a case where the internet is coming into people's homes, harm is coming into people's homes. It's not something that's happening to other people. And it dominates this sort of material that we see. So hopefully the opportunity, so how do we tackle the problem? I think it's great having Gordon and Fred here, as they both, I think, take education and regulation are very much part of the three-pronged approach of how to tackle child sexual abuse online. The work that IWF have done, we have run a prevention campaign, two campaigns really at the same time. One was aimed at children, which was sent on to TikTok and other places that children were engaging with, targeting girls 11 to age 13, encouraging them to look out for predatory behavior, to block people who are approaching them, to report in the app or report to a trusted adult, and to try to raise parental awareness. And for the parents, we simultaneously ran a campaign that encouraged them, that made them aware of the risks of what a child might be doing up in their bedroom without knowing, and encourage parents to have a talk with their parents, and then create that relationship where they can talk to their parents about online behavior and ensure they're not going to be caught, coerced, or otherwise create material which could follow them around for many years. Technology absolutely has a part to play. I know Gordon was saying that there wasn't much AI in his presentation. I'm afraid there's not a huge amount of AI in mine either, but it's definitely really a massive area of opportunity, I think, in the future. Technology is not a magic bullet, but there are some amazing stuff going on, which we've seen some real dent in the problem. At IWF, we have an in-house tool called IntelliGrade, which we use for hashing and grading. So hashing is where we are taking an image, assessing the content of that image, including age, gender, sexual activity, and then we're converting them into hashes, cryptographic and perceptual. We can then send those anonymous hashes, those digital fingerprints or strings of numbers to industry members. They all can go into tools where we can automatically detect perceptually similar content wherever it's uploaded or shared, so we can detect and block content as soon as it becomes known. It's very powerful, very effective. It's been around for some time. It's used in many of the large technology companies, and it's been a really effective way of finding and removing known child sexual abuse. The issue that we have with creating known abuse is, when does it become known? It might start in that self-generated, that webcam. IWF is generally, we are active in offender spaces or dark web, forums, image hosts, social media. And too often when we find time we found content and create known content for people to remove, it's already been around. It's already too late. It's already been circulating. So what we've done is, in partnership with the NSPCC in the UK, we've created a system where children can, with the help of the NSPCC, can report their own images. That enables us to then assess them and hash them and hopefully get them blocked and removed before they get circulated to the dark web and before they're out there for offender consumption. I think it's a really important part of finding and removing this content as early as possible. The other aspect we've done is to try to address demand. So we know one of the pathways to see some consumption is via legal pornography sites. We've developed an interactive chatbot, which is not currently using AI. And I can take some questions on that later if people are interested in that, but really very structured, but just as a way of trying to engage with and divert people. So if someone is on a legal pornography site and they put in a search term which might be associated with children, their chatbot will pop up and alert them on a web page and say, did you know what you were looking for was associated with children? Do they want to get help? Are you sure that's what you want to do? And it's really attempt to try to create some friction and divert people away, the ones that are sort of on that pathway, which is something which is a known area. Of course, technology and education are part of it. The problem with technology is it's voluntary. The internet is a largely unregulated place. These solutions exist, they're effective, but you don't have to use them. And regulation, I think, is a key part of those sort of trilogy there. We really need regulation, good, effective regulation that's going to help support best practice. So we can detect known doses. There's great promising AI machine learning solutions to address the challenge of new material we haven't seen before. We have preventative tools like the chatbots, parental control tools. There was a recent announcement from Apple. They've just rolled out a tool to detect nudity on iPhones. And then similar to the example that Stephanie showed with the languages and prompt blur images, all of these things are there, they're proven, but they're voluntary. So regulation, I think, is a key part. It's great to have Fred here as well to talk about what OfCom will be doing in the future of how these education, technology, and regulation can sort of come together to make the world, make the online a safer place for children. That is my presentation concluded. Hopefully, I wasn't timing. Hopefully, I wasn't too far over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. No, I think you were perfectly in time. Yeah, I think we will go straight on to our final presentation, and then we can hopefully have a discussion and talk about some of these things in more detail. So I'm going to briefly introduce our third and final speaker, Fred Langford, who is Director of Online Technology at OfCom, which is the regulator in the UK for communication services. And he was previously the Deputy Chief Executive of the Internet Watch Foundation. And he is a widely respected expert on child safety and has years of experience working in the wider technology sector. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, Fred. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Stephanie. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm just going to share my screen. So, won't be a moment. Apologies if I stumble a little bit because I can't see you at all while I'm presenting. So I'm just going to crack on. I do feel like I've got a little bit of the graveyard shift here, but I'll carry on. Nice to meet you. Yes, my name's Fred Langford. I'm Director of Online Technology here at OfCom and have worked in and around well, the web since it was developed all those years ago, just under 30 years ago, and predominantly in and around trust and safety of some sort online. But today I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what Ofcom does and you know, children's use of internet technology and a little bit more about algorithms. But I'm just going to dip in and out of some of the stuff we're doing because it's such a broad area for us. So how do children use the internet today? This is taken quite a lot from Ofcom's own Online Nations report. The new one's coming out very, very shortly, if it's not already out last week, I think. So please do have a look at it. But it's no surprise most children are active online from an early age. And I've got a slide that will come up. We'll just highlight just how much that has developed over those years. But up to 30% of 5 to 7-year-olds now using social media. So you can clearly work out yourselves that as 13 is the age of most of these social media apps in the first place, that someone somewhere, probably a parent or a sibling, is providing that access. So that said, there are all sorts of networks around schools to provide other pupils with access to social media sites. And we'll get into the discussion around what regulators can do to try and help with that. But 95% are watching content on video platforms and video sharing platforms, no surprise there. How are they accessing these? Well, part of that is voice activation, which obviously you guys are focusing on. And what can go wrong there, obviously. We're here to try and work all of that out. But I mean, you can tell us also that children's time grows online, and to the points that Gordon was making earlier, we don't actually know all the reasons why they grow online. Some could be beneficial, other ones obviously more harmful. And I remember the times people talking about digital natives and everything was based around screen time, whereas it was highlighted as the research started developing around that actually not all screen time is bad time. What we can see here is that kids do interact with different types of services and adults as well. So they're early adopters. No surprise there. I'm showing my age if I start talking about Betamax and VH videos and how much I used to drive my parents insane with lack of tech support when they needed it because they were programs I wanted to watch or record. But like I say, most of the children's or much of the children's social media use that we found is focused on watching social video and playing games. No surprise. So I'm just going to put this slide up there. I'm not going to talk for too long about it, but you can just see that how use of online changes with age. Some interesting statistics around the age of 5 and 6 where things go up and then go back down as age 7. We're not quite sure where that anomaly comes from, but in general you can see that these things are moving up. So I said I was going to talk a little bit about algorithms because even though it's not necessarily just AI, I mean, obviously there are AI algorithms, ML algorithms, all sorts of different algorithms, but because it's such a focus around what happens to children's experiences online, it's key for us now. And I'll always keep drawing back that with the increased use of voice activated tools, that most of these things now are used by devices. So I'm a great user of voice activation on my phone. I use Siri, but there are other ones. You know, we've got Alexa, there's the Google app as well. There's all sorts of ones out there as well, and different markets. But what do they actually do? Well, what do algorithms do? They personalize news feeds. And what we talk about news feeds here, we can even be talking about those video feeds we're talking about for those on TikTok, and targeting adverts. So how are the algorithms being run over the data in the first place? Are they being used for a commercial reason, or are they for a protection reason, or is it some sort of other link that they're trying to draw that user into? Choice architecture, image and video filters, synthetic media, voice-enabled search. So, I mean, there's all sorts of benefits and harms. I'm not going to read these all out end to end, but you can tell that particularly around things to do with, if there's no duty of care with the systems, they can cause harm. But obviously there are lots of benefits to algorithms as well. So I use an anecdotal one. My son's 22, absolutely fascinated with very boxy shaped Japanese cars. Don't ask me where it comes from, but he is absolutely fascinated with it. He finds TikTok fantastic. He thinks that the algorithms are really good for directing him to that particular niche that he's interested in. But if you sort of play around it a bit differently, you can see how there are potential harms there, how it can distort body image, and how it can push kids into those sort of areas where they're reinforcing thoughts and beliefs that might not necessarily be healthy for them, should we say. But personalized news content, like I say, repeatedly exposes kids to that same content, so it's reinforcing over and over again. If you use that sort of sales mentality, try and sell something to somebody 8 times over, and they will in the end convert and buy something. It's a similar sort of endorphin hit that people are getting, and these systems are built in a way to try and build those addictions. There are many books out there. Build a $1 billion app is a classic example of how people are tying you in with those sorts of feed loopbacks, positive or negative, all very much worked out, but it's to drive that revenue generally. We talk about AI-powered image and video filters. I mean, Dan's spoken a bit about the different use. Is it AI or is it ML? I mean, we're talking about true AI for content classifiers for trying to recognize harmful content in videos, or is it a combination of machine learning? Well, I'll talk a little bit about in the future about what OfCom are going to do around that to do with the online safety bill. But AI-powered search engines are making it easier for children to find pornographic and sexually explicit content. We are really finding that. So the exciting part, the online safety bill. So as everyone's been talking about, there is no real regulation, but you're seeing there's more and more regulation coming on board. So the Australian E-Commissioner, they have regulation over in Australia as well. And there's a raft of countries looking at different sorts of regulation. We've got the Digital Services Act in the EU that's being passed as well. So you can see that things are changing as far as regulation takes place. The landscape has changed, and politicians around the globe are trying to rein in some of that power, and so they have more control over it. So in the UK, that has manifested itself in the online safety bill, and you may love or hate it. It's going through Parliament at the moment, being debated, but fundamentally the aim is to hold the internet companies accountable for the content that's being uploaded on their services. And as Dan says, how technology interacts with that, and what Ofcom can do to nudge and encourage, and ultimately, if it doesn't work with nudge and encouragement, just to actually mandate that certain things need to be done on platforms. So really, it's about covering illegal content, including terrorist and CSA, EA, that's child sexual exploitation and abuse material. But there are lots more illegal pieces in there. So we were talking about suicide and encouragement of suicide, etc. These things have now been added based upon Law Commission recommendation. So among other requirements in scope services with child users, so how these are scoped out to be finalised, we'll have to carry out and keep an up-to-date children's risk assessment. So everybody has to carry out a risk assessment, but the larger platforms have to carry out a specific children's risk assessment. And then use proportionate systems and processes to protect children from anything that they've identified, but also from legal but harmful content. But it does say at the bottom here separately, the bill requires services hosting provider pornographic content to prevent children from encountering that material. So that's very much around, you would have heard the debates about age assurance, age verification. We talk about them as digital identity. So what does the bill say about algorithms? Again, I'm not going to read every line, but it's more about making sure that how those algorithms are impacting the risk of users. So if you think about online safety bill, very much around systems and processes, but it gets confused sometimes with the content, because the content is the outcome of whether or not the system and processes have worked correctly. So a lot of people are focusing on, well, if you've seen one piece of content, then for it's incorrect. That's not necessarily the case. So we'll be working with the providers to see what actually happened there. But there's lots in the bill about algorithms, and I'm sure you can all read through that yourself if you want to go to sleep one evening. So we're not, like I said, we're not going to be regulation or moderating individual pieces of content, but just to put in as well, the government intends for the bill to give us robust information gathering and enforcement powers. So I think what this has done is really changed the shift of power. Like I said earlier, it's very much about power. There's lots of discussions taking place. You've seen this with Frances Haugen and the whistleblowing at Meta, whereby things are taking place within the platforms, and it's not becoming public knowledge until somebody comes out and whistleblows. And it's not easy to do that. And there's places like the Integrity Institute are working on trying to encourage people to do that. But ultimately, we want to get in a place where you don't need somebody to whistleblow, because the systems and processes are working correctly in the first place. So I just wanted to point out some other relevant OfCom work as well. So we're also the regulator for the video service provider regulation, the video sharing platforms. We have a Making Sense of Media program. So I've been listening throughout the afternoon, lots of people talking about educating people on what actually is going on. And I spoke about digital natives, and it's a term that used to follow, but is a digital native someone who's just a consumer of that those platforms, or is it that they actually understand what's going on behind the scenes? Well, actually, it's more to do with the consumer side, because you would have to have an element of technical knowledge and understand what the motivations are from a business perspective as well, to really understand why these companies are building these tools. But really, I mean, the focus of what I'm going to be doing is research into online safety technology, what actually is out there, what can be done. So to provide an example, synthetic media. You may know it's deep fakes. We've carried out a lot of research in and around how synthetic media is generated, what sorts of things could we do to protect people from synthetic media that may be misinformation, disinformation. It could be encouraging people to commit terror attacks, all sorts of different things. But the technology is always generating, always changing, and the use cases are always changing. So we really see this as a bit of an arms race. But fundamentally, what Ofcom is now here to do is to finalize what technology is, what best practice looks like effectively, and move everyone to get to that position whereby they are protecting citizens online. So with that, I'll stop sharing the screen and open up for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Fred. Yes, so please, if you do have questions, put them in the chat or raise your hand. I would also like to invite and at least give people from the previous sessions the opportunity to join in now. So maybe if anyone is still around from the previous session, or maybe also from the work in progress session that happened earlier, feel free to join at this point. And I would also like to start with maybe opening the floor, the virtual floor, up to the three of you and ask you if you have any questions or comments that you would like to address to each other straight away. Or maybe, yes.
I'll ask a question of Fred and Dan, if I may. I'm going to ask this as if I know nothing about the area of online engagement, digital world, impacts on young people, etc. Fred, you and I, I'm probably not a million miles away from each other in terms of age group, because you gave the age of your son. I have a son similarly age, so Dan, you look a lot younger. But I'm going to say, so Fred and Gordon, if I was to revisit the starting place for e-nurture, which is where might a parent, where might a teacher, where might an adult with professional interest working with young people go to for evidence-based resources to inform their practice around digital world influences? Are we in a better place in 2022 than we were in 2018? to one, understand risks, of course, but also to begin the conversation around how do we harness the opportunities to a world that is not going to go away, digital world. And Fred, you use an age group, and I was really struck in some of, this is now the researcher speaking again, not just the parent, I was really struck in some of my conversations with young people. So one of the big features of e-nurture is that we have a very active youth panel that inform all aspects of our work, and I should have highlighted that when in the brief presentation. But I'm probably every 3 months, either online now or previously in person, with groups of young people from age 6 through to age 18. And I was really struck by how informed very young people are, primary school, 6, 7-year-olds, around the digital world and their experiences, and how little they felt their parents understood about that world. And I would still say, even now, my now 15-year-old would come home and regularly keep me up to date. But if I try and find his knowledge through evidence-based resources, through its standard academic searches, I still think we're behind the line. What are your thoughts on that? Long question, but just what are your thoughts?
I'm happy to dive in there, actually, because it's been a challenge for us as well at OfCom, and I think it's the challenge we have is around how we can engage with children under 13, particularly in an ethical manner, and without actually influencing the conversations and pushing them towards potentially harmful behaviour themselves, or exposing them to harmful thoughts and etc. that they wouldn't previously have. Can I just put you on hold 1 minute? I'm just going to have to leave it to Dan, because I've got a persistent man knocking on my window trying to deliver something behind me. So I'm really sorry. I'll come back and finish off that in about 2 minutes.
I would so anecdotally, so our remit and our work is it's very niche. It's just one sort of online harm, so just the material, images and videos of sexual material. But there's a really interesting dynamic there between what is a child investigating their sexuality. At what point is taking photos and sending nudes and stuff just a normal thing to do? Now, when we find those sorts of images, we find them in offender spaces. So at that point, they are illegal, that they're being used for the sexual gratification of offenders. But at the point they're created, that's not necessarily the case. And when we released this report remove tool to enable children to report their own images, it was with that understanding that actually the law is in the UK, a child sending us an image of themselves, a sexual image of themselves, is illegal. Is that risk and that real concern of, are we criminalizing children by reporting that, because they're not allowed to send images even of themselves? So that was actually one of the most difficult things in that project, was not the technology, it was the legislation around, and the law itself is behind the reality. We internally, the IWF, we had when we're hiring people, we had a policy of if someone applies, we might ask the question of, well, have you ever shared material? And this was kind of a red line, is because what if someone shared material and then you come across that material as an analyst? And I think there's been a realization, we've got to a generation now where if we're excluding every person that shared material, you're excluding every person under 30, because it's just a normal thing. And actually, although I look younger, I'm certainly at that barrier where it was not normal for me. The internet didn't really happen with broadband revolution until I was in my 20s. So this was not a normal thing for me, but for pretty much anyone maybe 5 years younger than me before that, it's a normal part of growing up. So what children used to go around the bike sheds, they're now on WhatsApp. This is a case of, it's a normal thing. Part of the education is making them understand the permanence of that. It's not just you shared it with one person, but how do you stop that from going to someone else and someone else and someone else? And how then once it's on the internet, how do you stop it? It could be on there for decades. How do you then get it off the internet? So it's the permanence of the internet, but then you're balancing that with, children will do what children do, and they're going to investigate and do things which I have young children. I don't understand the world that they're going to be growing up in, because I didn't. And I think we've got generation upon generation of parents which are absolutely in that. But we see the very harmful part of that, but that connection between having a parent that understands the online world and actually can give advice other than, I'm just not giving them a phone, because that's not going to work, because they're going to be in the online world eventually, and just refusing to let them be online is not going to be the best way of preparing them. I'll let Fred continue.
Thanks for diving in there, Dan. there's a new classic. Delivery man has to take a picture with the front door open and me holding the package. So you can see. I won't start talking about trust networks because you'll start me off about something entirely different. Yeah, just to pick up on the point, Gordon, you're absolutely right around research, and we've started thinking about synthetic media. I talked about it earlier. Whether or not we can actually start using avatars, whether or not those avatars influence what can we do online, because even if we use avatars in research online, you can influence what takes place with some of the algorithms. So with the algorithms, if you think about them, for those that don't necessarily understand, you would have heard a lot of terminology around algorithmic auditing. It's twice as difficult to say as it is to actually do. But actually, there are billions of points in many of these artificial intelligence algorithms that are taking place. So actually looking at the code is irrelevant. It's much more about how good was the quality of the data to start with going in, to Dan's point. Absolutely. Or was it biased? Well, there's bias in all data sets. We're yet to find it, and I know that researchers really struggle because they use traditional data sets that have been used and made available online that have a lot of that bias baked in, and you can't actually get the data sets that you really need to be able to train the models that are unbiased because of all sorts of protections. But this is why I was talking about what are we interested in? Well, it's the output. Actually, if your systems and processes are in place correctly, I'll talk about this as a regulator's point of view, then that output should not have been harmful in the first place, because ultimately when you're testing your developments, network software developments, I'm talking about content classifiers, moderation systems, all these sorts of things. But when you actually change those, how you test them and how you roll them out are really the important thing as well. And if a human made a decision to enable a particular algorithm to be deployed without fully testing it, then there's a real problem there. And I've drifted way off your question there, Gordon. I do understand that, but I just wanted to get that point in as well.
No, really helpful. Stephanie, I don't want to take over a chair. Can I just come very back, because I know there's an online question. It's really helpful, Fred and Dan. And I would pose a question in part response to Marcus Tomlin's question as well. So when I first started working in this area, particularly with focus on advising parenting, that's my core card-carrying job, supporting parents support their children. The question I would get most frequently is, what's the reason why I have time to be online? That was the standard question. Screen time, that was the standard question pre-pandemic. Now ask that question, where young people and adults are spending every day online, from schoolwork to work, etc., etc. That question has gone. Now we know that the greater bulk of the day is online for the past couple of years. So again, with research and data, what questions are we asking to future-proof our knowledge of the online world? Not how frequently do you use, devices or online engagement, but why are you engaged? What is the purpose? What is the outcomes associated with that? So the question about AI or ML systems that don't currently exist, I think we need to be really clear about what questions we don't yet have answers to, rather than data based on questions that are now outdated.
I just to say that I think relates to that. One of the things we see, technologists are always looking for the best. They're always quite utopian. This is going to change the world. I mean, this is why they were child sexual abuse on the internet. No one thought that was going to happen. No one assumed there's so much demand, there'd be so much generation, and it's because people that create technology think the best of the world, I think, and that happens. And people are not generally thinking, what would a bad guy do with this? How would someone use this to do harm? And I think the metaverse has been a really interesting story as we see that. I mean, I think everyone will have the different views on where that's going to go and how popular that will become. But immediately, as soon as the metaverse started become a thing, you started getting used on there, we saw stories about harm. We saw about if you create a space, you'll get a racial abuse, sexual abuse, you get child abuse. These things sort of happen in these places. And I think not just what AI system do you need that would help the safety, it's got to be looking at what new technology we're creating, how are people going to use that for harm, and then how are you going to stop that harm? And one of those solutions might be an AI tool. One of those systems might be something the regulator might, like that we talked about adult pornography and age verification. You know, maybe that's a solution to reduce that. If it's someone being groomed, then it might be language. Then we're looking at AI language, or how do you know what patterns offenders might use when they're trying to interact with children? Can you identify an adult pretending to be a child? Is there technology can do that? One part of it. Could you also stop adults getting onto the platforms in the first place and make sure children are separated? So it is a whole framework you need to look at. And I think AI definitely has areas which it can do things, and it can do things that people can't. But it's looking at what technology is coming, where's the harm. The thing is, the technology just moves so fast. The metaverse is now it's becoming a thing where a few years ago it was from literally from a science fiction book, not a utopian science fiction book. It was very much a dystopian science fiction book. But nevertheless, I think we're always behind on that, and I think a regulator is going to have a really hard time actually keeping up with that as well, because I know a lot of what Fred and his team do are looking about what's happening next. How do we get ready for the next bit before it happens and it's here, and then the harm is there, and then it's too late to put it back in the box.
Good segue there, Dan. Thanks. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, the what happening next part is quite key, and there are many more factors. So Dan will know this as well, which is people look at online technology like it's some sort of separate entity, like technology is a part of the online. Okay, well, it's all technology. There is a technology influence, and the reason I say this is because how the fundamental backbone of the internet functions actually impacts greatly on the capabilities of what can take place online. So there's a real push to encrypt absolutely everything from the device to wherever, and actually while it's sitting on rest on a server somewhere in the cloud, which effectively that moves everything to the edge. So when we talk about the edge, people are talking about between these 2 points. So when they think about AI and ML that needs to be developed that can protect children, it's device side stuff we're talking around really. Now, some of the challenges around there, obviously the security of the data sets. How can you get a data set that actually is going to be able to scan for potentially known illegal imagery on a device? Dan mentioned Apple and their nudity filter as well. How can you secure that? Can you have a trusted executable environment within a chip that's on a phone? I'm getting into the sort of horizon scanning side of things now, but when I say horizon scanning, it's not a million miles away. We're talking 18 months, possibly, and so these sorts of things are taking place now, and it's a great question, because a lot of people talk about horizon scanning, emerging technology, and what I'm here to say is it just happens. I mean, the whole mentality of West Coast states software companies is around disruption, and now, whereas previously you would need a lot of costs, a lot of research and development to do something, you need a laptop and you need to be able to code. And that's about it these days, and follow a few rules and you can get something out there that could become the next unicorn app. And before you know it, it's causing all sorts of harm online. Just to touch on Dan's point as well about sort of metaverse and extended reality things, yes, absolutely. If you can add into the I'm here to talk about all the harmful things. Obviously, that's what I do. If you add into the mix there as well that you've got the physical nature of it. So when you think about all the harms as they manifest, bullying becomes real. You've got omnidirectional sound that you're wearing. It could be in an augmented reality scenario whereby you've got your lovely new Snap glasses on and you're scrolling away, walking around in the street, and somebody's posted something that only you can see because it's linked to your particular ID, because that's the way that the technology is done. So actually, there's a lot that can be done already that's not being done. That's what we're here to do as a regulator, but there's a whole lot more to be done in the future. Absolutely.
There is another question in the chat, and I think probably relates a bit to the legislation bit, regarding larger and smaller companies. So how do we balance what is realistic versus what we would all like to see? This means only the largest tech companies like Apple or Meta can afford to stay ahead of the legislation. Does this play to them rather than the smaller companies?
Yeah, very good question, and something we talk about, because obviously OfCom are here for all companies. in effect, I mean, the regulation focuses much more on category 1 companies. So what we talk about in category 1 companies are the bigger companies that have a large reach. But that said, it doesn't mean the risk is all on the larger platform. So you can have a smaller platform with an increased amount of risk. And what can you do there? Going back to the sort of the edge case scenario, there are certain pieces of tech. You could have something called software development kit, SDK, that's built, hardwired or hard coded into the operating system, and it can be open closed by these operating platforms to allow people to develop tools. There are all sorts of initiatives around encouraging safety tech providers by the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, particularly in the UK, but also lots of safety technology providers being pushed out in the US as well in other companies, with the idea that they're going to provide these sort of services for the smaller, medium enterprises. But that said, I mean, there is also a question to ask about what's going to be most effective. If you want to cover, the largest amount of people, would it be better to be able to encourage those large platforms to make the tools available for free to the smaller platforms because they've got all of that resource behind them, or is it better to try and push a nascent sort of sector of technology, hoping that it'll get picked up by the larger platforms? I don't have all the answers to these. I'm just saying these are the sorts of questions that we're actually asking internally as well. There's something called the Digital Markets Unit, which is set up already, another regulatory body that is trying to look at how these digital markets all work together, because it's different to traditional monopolies, and because you build in that global outlook as well, and like I say about the nature of how unicorns come on board really quickly, you can see that actually it's not a straightforward sort of question that's going to be there, but fundamentally it's about trying to offer as many opportunities as possible and keeping that cost down. We have a recognition within the bill that OfCom have to have a consideration for the cost of anything that we implement.
I just say I think it's a very interesting question from Ben, and definitely one that it's good to hear that regulators are aware of it. It definitely has, I'm sure Ben would agree, been a kind of a rise or an uptick in the safety tech companies. So companies that just provide just the bit that is going to protect children against this, or going to stop sort of harmful behaviour. I think then that's probably a realization that this is going to become normalised, that you're going to have to do something. And traditionally, these big companies, Meta and Apple, they write their own code. They don't use others. But that does mean you get the technology developing in just those places. And then how does everyone else do it? Not everybody can create an AI grooming tool. So I think that's positive, seeing a sort of third group coming up to just create those things and make them available. And the other option is, certainly those companies getting together, open sourcing those tools, getting together to actually make that available to everybody. Because it's much like anything. When regulation comes in, organizations come up to help organizations to adhere to that regulation, to make sure they're not breaking the law. And it's a whole industry that develops alongside it. So I think that's positive. But yeah, I think there'll be a very fine line trying to judge between only the big companies can use this, but what about the small ones? Because everybody should be taking online safety seriously, but not everyone's going to have the same resources to be able to build the tools that Apple and Meta are.
Well, thank you. I kind of have another or a follow-up question, I guess, to your presentation, Dan, when you talked about the chatbot that you designed or are using, and I think you said you specifically chose not to use AI, or it isn't based on AI. Can you maybe say a bit more about what motivated that decision, or more about the process?
Certainly. So originally, that was one of the conceptions, was to make use of AI as an emerging technology. How can this help? Very quickly realized that the chatbot is interacting, the language it uses and the way it talks has got to be very specific to the type of person that it's talking to and the environment that it's in at that time. So somebody that's going onto a legal pornography site that is looking for child sexual abuse material is a very different person in a very different environment. I mean, this is a person that's looking for sexual gratification at that point. The language you use there is going to be very different to somebody browsing on a forum that might look something or somewhere else. So we realized that you can't just make up something that's just going to talk. And then we had very real concerns about the the psychological state of people that are looking for child sexual abuse. There's a lot of guilt. There's a lot of concern for those people, and we're really worried. Like, if an AI tool says the wrong thing, could it lead to harm? Could it lead to somebody self-harming? Could it lead to somebody suiciding? If it's too hard, because they're too sort of, if you're trying to disrupt or deter people from looking for this material, you might go with a think about the consequences, people are getting hurt, or you might go with you're going to get caught, the police are going to come after you. And there's different research as to which is more successful as kind of warning messaging. But there's always that risk that if you go too hard on one side, what if the chatbot ends up saying something that leads to somebody hurting themselves? And we just felt at that time, we just weren't confident enough that it would be able to do what we needed to do in that sort of unsupervised environment. So the AI capabilities and the learning capabilities were effectively turned off. Static flow, you ask a question, gives a set of answers, and we can control that flow. I think it would be really interesting to see if it can do more than that, because all it really is doing is signposting, disrupting, redirecting. It's not counseling. It's not trying to actually get into trying to understand, learn, or help those people. It's just trying to say, by the way, what you're doing is wrong. Hopefully that's enough for someone to go, oh, it is wrong, I'm going to stop. And that is already a success. Or it's going to say, would you like to get help? And maybe they'll go to get help, and that will put them through, the chatbot will put them through to a real counsellor at the Lucy Faithful Foundation. Then they can have a chat, an instant message chat to a real person. But we certainly felt we weren't confident enough with the technology to just let the AI learn and talk unaided in case of that, potential harmful consequences.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have a somewhat related question regarding grooming, and which is obviously also happening on very popular messaging platforms like Skype, Facebook Messenger. And I always wonder, why is it possible? I mean, it seems to me, from what I understand, that people tend to use a very typical pattern of grooming children and young people. Why are these messages just allowed to get out there and not being flagged by these systems? Is there no consideration for that, or?
Well, I'm sure Fred will probably know some of the history behind some of these developments as well. But I'm certainly aware there have been some effective tools developed that can spot and moderate and flag those things. But there has been some reluctance, or we just haven't seen them actually deployed for various reasons, which I know has been very frustrating for those involved. But it is definitely an area where it can help. Like there are tools that can spot that. They're not as widely used as perhaps that. And again, because a lot of this is voluntary. And the trouble with any sort of AI-based, machine learning-based system is it's going to have a reasonable rate of error. And then what do you do with the error? And I think for a lot of organizations, it's what do you do when you falsely flag somebody as being accused of grooming has become more of a concern, perhaps potentially, than the risk of doing it. So if it's like 70-30, is that 30% too much? Is that so? What is the layer there? So I'm certainly aware of technology. We haven't been directly involved in any anti-grooming tool, but some of the organizations we work with have, and I know that have been successful. What would have been potentially successful tools which weren't deployed because in the end the companies that are using them declined to follow through and put them in.
Yeah, Fred,
Yeah,
I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I could probably talk quite a lot about the joys of grooming and software. I mean, the first thing I would say is a lot of these solutions were tested against test data. So it's does my model work against in the way I expect it against the test data? And we're just not scalable at all. So when everybody probably knows on this call who's working in AI plus internet equals bad things. And so just pointing AI just at data online and just thinking it's going to come back with something doesn't necessarily work very well. As I think there are many pieces of research out there that point that out. And the problem with these grooming tools not being as particularly accurate as well is the nature of grooming. So okay, the initial approach may be on a particular platform, and it'll be on a platform where kids are, but there's a lot of platform hopping, and there's no interoperability, there's no sort of collaboration between platforms at the moment in the same way as you would get the sort of the ugly mugs for if you're a landlord. Someone causes trouble in one particular pub, and the pitches are distributed to let other landlords know. There's none of this takes place at the moment, as in, we've banned this particular account on Meta, therefore it's going to be banned on another one, or banned on another one. That's just not there yet. I think we're slowly edging towards this. There's some discussions in Europe about interoperability, but they're particularly looking at messaging services at the moment, not talking about actually what takes place behind, and some of their fundamental understanding about how these platforms are architected seems to leave a little bit to be desired as well. So I think what's happening is we've got policymakers and technologists having a different level of understanding about how things work and how things can actually be implemented, and the policy folk, a small amount of knowledge can be quite dangerous on occasion. So it can set off a whole sort of thread of conversation. But I would say that the main challenges as well around trying to recognize, as you'll know in language, is that, it's all around context. It's all around who is communicating with who. It's around local dialect and language. It's about what language you're using. Some people, I live in Cambridge, lots of dual linguistic people here. So people, my daughter's friends, they'll jump from speaking in one language to another language just in the same sentence. I mean, how does that work on occasions when other things are popped in? It just doesn't. Now, what I will say, there is a huge amount of research and development going into this from these industry players, because they understand that actually this is the key. And when we're talking about AI and voice activated tools, Meta are throwing a lot of resource into trying to build supercomputer to be able to actually work out the problem of language effectively in technology. And it's quite fascinating actually, educating people in OfCom, just to show them how clunky this language to text conversion actually is when they see it in front of them. That you see jaws drop. You say it's not great. People just think it's really whizzy. Well, when I say Alexa, it works. No, it doesn't actually. And we just had this news story where a child was asked to do the penny test on the plug. That's not Alexa working, and it's certainly not Alexa working for kids. So I think it's still very crude, a lot of this stuff, but polished very well in marketing terms, to make people feel like actually it's providing some sort of a realistic, high-tech quality service, when in fact it's fairly clunky behind the scenes.
Maybe another question related more to the regulation bit. Fred, you mentioned that, or I mean, I think it's been discussed in the media as well, the distinction of the online harms bill of harmful content and what is considered harmful and what is actually illegal. You touched upon this a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate a bit more on what is actually is officially considered harmful but still legal, and maybe also what are the technical challenges involved in differentiating between the two?
Yep, I will sidestep the what is harmful question, because I'll say Parliament's decision to choose that one. I certainly have views on it, but fundamentally, I think the challenges are definitions. I mean, if you're trying to ask a machine to do something, it needs a really, really specific definition, not something that can be worked on or worked through sort of loosely, which is really where politicians work. They don't work in detail; they work in big pictures and rhetoric. So on occasions, some of the things in the bill we're sort of looking at and thinking really needs very, very, very strong definitions here. And I think there lies the challenge. And where's the priority? I mean, one harm to one person should be a priority over another. How are people actually harmed? I mean, it comes down to resilience. So, I'm an Arsenal fan. My football team lose. I've got no resilience at that point. I'm open to any sort of fraud and harm, because I'm just walking around like a bear with a sore head. Whereas other days I may feel really resilient to these harms. So actually, how people could be a victim of some sort of harm changes throughout the day and throughout the week and throughout the year. And there's all sorts of other factors around it. So we've been looking at around the theories of harm, and trying to develop a better idea. But ultimately, like I say, it's not about an individual piece of content getting through. So it's very much around the considerations of the platforms, and how did you carry out your risk assessment? How did you mitigate the risk that you identified? Is that sufficient? If they can't provide evidence that it was sufficiently, no, the risk was there. So an example would be big glowing red risk. If we release this, it's absolutely going to cause harm to everybody. Now, just the purpose of carrying out that risk assessment and saying, well, we carried out a risk assessment and we saw the harm was there, but there was no way we could mitigate it, it's not good enough. I mean, that's going to be where the regulator would come in and say, actually, no, you're going to get fined every day until you do something about it. So I suppose the answer is not really that clear, but I think there's still a lot to be debated. We've just had the second reading in Parliament. Whether or not we end up with the same government, who knows what's going to happen by the time this does end up working through Parliament as well, and what the different views will be because of what's taking place in Ukraine. That's already influencing some of the debate around the privacy enhancing technologies used online as well. There's a lot to play for, I think, is what I'm trying to say at the moment.
Thank you. We have another question or comment. I'm just going to read it out, but it's quite long. So maybe if you want to look at it as well, Dan and Fred, that might be useful. So I'm going to read out Bianca's comment. Speaking of parents, as part of my PhD, I'm currently carrying interviews with parents in Shropshire. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And one thing that is striking is how little they know about what is taking place online when their children use social media and online games. Not only most of our participants do not have accurate information, but they are also aware of it and wish they had more information. So my question is, based on your experience, what do you consider the best channels to provide parents with information useful to them, for example, online through schools, other channels, etc.? And what next steps could we put in place to rebalance the information asymmetry?
Absolutely fascinating. I'll dive in there first. I can see Dan's put the Safer Internet Centre down. Absolutely agree. Founding director, I think they're fantastic. Really, really good organisation. There are others out there. Internet Matters. There's lots of places, and Ofcom has a media literacy program, so it's very much about that. But you're right. I mean, this is something that I've got a particular personal interest in. I came from a very working class background, and now I've moved into a sort of a nice middle class background, and I find the conversations polar opposites. So in my world, it's very much about how much can parents get involved. Are parents being potentially a little bit overbearing and allowing their children enough freedom online? Whereas, you talk to I'm not going to pick on working class because I think that's probably unfair, but the lower socioeconomic groups whereby they might be working 3 jobs, they might be from broken families, just getting your hands on a telephone in itself would be quite something, and there's no chance that the parents are going to know what to do with it. And in fact, they're probably asking you to do things on it that you shouldn't be doing anyway. So I think that trying to reset that is fundamentally through schools. I think it's the best place to get to kids. To educate them. But the problem we're going through schools is just making sure they get good quality understanding. But I think for me personally, I think quite a lot, and I mentioned it at the beginning of my presentation about what are the motivations. I think sometimes the kids forget what the motivation of the business is. The motivation is to make money. And that's what businesses are there for. So as long as that's the fundamental part that they're starting with, actually educate the kids. What do you think these internet companies are doing? They're not doing all of this for altruistic reasons. They're not just doing it to make it fun online. It is actually a business, and I think that debate was really at the forefront of everyone's minds about 10 years ago. If the product's free, you're the product, etc. But it seems to have been lost a little bit in some of the thought processes. So I do think that sometimes let's not forget what's already taken place previously. But just to say, reinforcement as well. I mentioned it earlier about 8 times of sales, all the time, regularly in the curriculum. Not like my daughter's school, which was one hour session a year. I mean, the kids basically, I asked her because obviously I've got an interest. I asked my eldest daughter, what did you gauge for that? She's 11. What did you actually gauge from that? What was the answer I got? She had actually forgotten it by the time she'd even got home. Now, I even with pressing, and she's not a disruptive kid, I'll put it out there. Even with pressing, there wasn't a lot, and I was a bit frustrated. But I won't name who the training provider was, but it was clear that the people providing the training didn't really have enough of a knowledge base. So I do think that actually it's something that needs to be treated properly on the school curriculum.
I'll just add that so Gordon asked an interesting question when he started here, is if you're redoing the guidance that was done in 2018, would you do it differently now? Well, TikTok was released in 2018. You know, the online is already a different place to what it was just those years ago. And for parents, there's one thing, but I think engaging with children, we certainly found when we tried to do this campaign to engage with children to get them to sort of be aware of predatory behavior and block. We went to influencers on TikTok, and we found that was very successful for that period of time that we were doing that, because those were the people that they were engaging with and listening to. But as it happens, you know, to do that you've got to, especially if you're advertising on TikTok, that's very expensive. Our campaign was a short period of time. It's one of those things, you can't just do it for a few months. It needs to be something that it is constant. So where is it that children are going? Where do they get advice from? How can you ensure that good safety advice is actually in those places? And for parents, how can you get parents confident enough to have a conversation with their children? It's hard enough for parents to have the conversation about, you know, you're growing up and people have sex and all that stuff. That's an embarrassing conversation to have with children, but mostly you're thinking, oh, well, you don't have to do that until they get to a certain age. But as soon as you give a child a smartphone, they're effectively in that world and they're being exposed to that sort of thing. And it's happening much, much earlier. And it's both embarrassment for the parents of having the conversation, having it so young, and actually having a conversation where you don't understand yourself because you have not lived through that and you have not had, you know, like that digital lives that they're going to have. I think that we're definitely getting to that gap as far in learning where we have parents, myself included, who lived in a different world to their children, and it is just very difficult to understand what they're going through. But it's not so you can't just say don't do it. That is there. I think that hopefully that will shift as more people who sort of grown up online will start to you know, that understanding will be there for those. But then again, maybe we'll be in a metaverse in 10 years time and it will shift again. So we're getting to, it's the pace of change is so so fast. I think it's a really, really good question. I don't know the answer. I think that's one that we're all looking for really, is where best to get the information, how do they get information to parents, schools and children.
There's another question about one of the examples that Fred mentioned, that Alexa told a child to do a penny challenge. That's more than an online safety risk. It's even a physical safety risk. I wonder what's your thought about the safety risks, both physical and digital, that might be posed by different types of the Internet of Things and smart home technologies when such technologies might not be designed with a child user in mind.
Absolutely, and I'll even expand that out as well to violence against women and girls. So we're fascinated about Internet Things devices in the home and domestic violence on top of that, because you know who has the admin account when they're setting these things up? Usually the abuser. And there are lots of things, but the physical, you know, the nature of the physical risk as well as the you know, the virtual risk, I suppose the digital risk you highlight is something that, you know, we picked up earlier when we were talking about extended reality, and it's very, very real. So an example would be that we're well aware that there were cases whereby a coercive partner was doing such things as dimming and brightening the TV in a home to threaten the partner, you know, saying things, sending messages elsewhere, but then using Google Home because this person had the admin rights to force that. But it's what are kids asking for, what's going on when parents are out as well, who are they allowing in, you know, virtually, and then potentially, you know, physically, you know, by giving out, I'm going to get into the world of cybersecurity here, but potentially giving away, you know, the operational security of that particular house that a parent has set up. You know, it's the same as anyone would try and hack into a system. Well, the easiest place to hack in is probably going to be for a, you know, to quiz a child or to challenge a child or make it seem like fun. You know, the different types, I don't think we've even quite got a head around just how many different types of IoT devices there are. So we're carrying out a project very much based around this, and we've built an example lounge in the OfCom offices with just about every IoT device that we could think of. And as we've been calling our suppliers, they've been pointing out that there are more devices that we hadn't even thought of. So I think what really needs to happen there, we get into standards. So you start developing standards, and it becomes very much a bit like trading standards. It would be tested and people would be finding about around that route. You're not going to be able to sell an IoT smart home technology at home if it's not gone through the age appropriate design code, as an example, by the Information Commissioner's Office. There are safety by design initiatives as well. So I think we're very much walking towards that sort of approach to try and tackle this, because we don't want to stifle innovation. In the same way that some of these the IoT devices are fantastic, but people don't necessarily recognize what the risks are until afterwards, and particularly quite a lot of the time it's around privacy as well. So thinking about the Amazon Ring and the direction that people were pointing. I mean, we've seen court cases of somebody saying, well, it's inside my house. Yes, but it's pointing in your neighbor's back garden and clearly looking in their window. So I think there's going to be a lot of test cases in court, and we will find out what's going to take place. But fundamentally, I think the answer to try and tackle this is much better standards.
So basically, I mean, what would you say, how difficult is it really to balance I guess the protection of children and the, I guess, freedoms or liberties of adults or people in general? That this concern has been raised, at least in the media, about any potential regulation. If we put them in place for children, will that restrict adults? Do you think that is a major concern, or what do you say are the main considerations for kind of finding that balance?
It's an interesting discussion. I know that the Open Rights Group carried out some research recently. I haven't managed to get my hands on the actual research data, very much focusing around the adults' access to pornographic websites, and how most adults would not be willing to provide their details to an age provider to be able to provide that third-party access. I can understand why adults would be worried about that. Actually, I would say yes, there are risks. Proportionality is written throughout the bill as Ofcom's consideration. Anything that Ofcom does has to be proportionate, and proportionality has been tested throughout the courts on other areas, not online regulation. So an example would be, is it proportionate to say that everybody's got to show that they're over 18 to access all sites, and all sites should be for children? Not saying that that's the approach that's going to be taken, but would that be proportionate? Well, no, of course not. It's the same proportionality test, I suppose, about how you where you sell alcohol. You have to take on board a lot of different factors. It may be proportionate in one scenario. I can think of certain platforms that, yes, you probably you're not going to get adult pornographic content on there, but you wouldn't want any children anywhere near it, just because of the nature of the conversations that are taking place on there. So I wouldn't like to just tie it down to sort of kids shouldn't see adult material, because actually no, they shouldn't. And that's the law in the UK. You may have a view on that either way, but the protections that could be put in place that could be a bit archaic actually have a chilling effect, and the unintended consequences are that you're driving people to sites that are never going to be regulated, and services that sit outside of any sort of jurisdictional control.
Well, I think that the discussion between safety and privacy is one that's been, it's very, very important. I think all of these issues, particularly with anything. So if you're looking at how an AI language tool might work, well, the tool needs to have access to the language. It needs to be able to see the communication, and then your proportionality again is it okay for it to see the communication? If it's seeing the communication, what's it doing with that information? Is it only there to stop and identify grooming? Is it also going to be pulling out other information? At what point are you impinging on people's right to privacy compared to protecting children? And I think there is a lot of conflict there. Our concern at IWF, seeing the results of harm, seeing what happens, what has happened on the internet, of seeing that firsthand, is we know the consequences of not doing anything. I've said before, technologists create these utopian ideas. They don't think about how it's going to be used for harm, and they are used for harm. And actually, that needs to be addressed. You can't just say to everyone, "Be nice," and then privacy. So everything's completely private. No one can see anything what people are doing. That creates reduces, there's no risk for harmful behavior. Lots of discussions about anonymity. Are people worse if they're anonymous? Are they meaner to other people if they're anonymous? Do they commit more abuse, harm, crime? So there's a lot of concern there about that balance between privacy. And as I said, proportionality is really key there, is you can't do nothing, but you also can't just have everything plain text and everyone reads everything. There has to be a level between the two. And I think technology that includes privacy is causing some issues with the detection and prevention of harm, but there's no reason why the organizations and the engineers and the communities working on privacy enhancing technology can't also be looking at enhancing technology to detect harm in a privacy-focused, privacy-centric way. The trouble is that that is a very difficult place. There are some very entrenched ideological positions. Simply, privacy is number one. No intrusion is okay. There's just too much harm will be allowed to go through if that's the case. So there has to be a level somewhere where my personal privacy, the ability for organizations to intercept my communications is limited, but at the same time we can't allow child sexual abuse material and grooming and other these things to happen without the technological solutions rely on having some sort of proportional access to data. And you remove the access to data, those solutions disappear, and the worry is that will increase harm. So that is a very active conversation. And that's being had vigorously both at big tech companies and non-government organizations. It's very much, I don't very much have a view on that, but and definitely some concerns over that. But it's I don't see any reason why we can't be developing tools that are both privacy-centric, respect your privacy on the internet, but are also be able to detect and prevent harm. Because I think the things can coexist. It shouldn't just be a binary one or the other.
You both kind of addressed or mentioned that currently, and I tend to agree, that currently systems are not robust enough, especially detection systems. So how would you say, do we get to a point where these systems are actually good enough to be put into action? Do you see that happening anytime soon? And how would you maybe judge the role of the different parties, I suppose, industry, academia, research, and policy or government?
Yeah, detection systems. I mean, that's a fascinating one because I suppose it depends on what you're trying to detect and when and where, etc. But I mean, in general, and a lot of this has come out of the research into synthetic media, misinformation, disinformation that OfCom's been carrying out as well, which is very much about authenticating the source originally, and and developing a system whereby at least people know if that media is being manipulated in some way. Now, not to say that that's going to solve individuals who are posting content, user-generated content wherever they are, but there are also techniques and tips and tricks using metadata and all sorts of other things and EXIF data. I won't go into all those. Dan will know what they are, that you can potentially identify who's done what and where, depending on how those systems are being built, can really change that. Just to try and build a lot more trust. I mean, I mentioned trust earlier. There are issues around trust generally in society at the moment, I think we're seeing, but they're really, really polarized online. So how can you provide that zero trust, if you see what I mean? So what we're trying to say is, well, if you treat everybody as you don't trust them online, which is fundamentally from a cybersecurity perspective the best way to start. I don't trust anybody. How can you actually build into any systems, a mechanism that enables them to be able to go back and check the integrity of that data right from the start? Because what we've got really is just the sheer volume of manipulation, I would probably say, online of individuals, and that may be from state actors, it may be from business, it may be with good intentions initially, trying to nudge people to do something that they think will make them healthier. Well, whose decision was it that you should be nudging people to make something better for them? Is the person not the one who should be deciding whether or not that's better? So there's a lot of pulling around taking place at the moment, and as Dan had already said, just with the sheer pace of things at the moment, it's very, very difficult to try and build in something from the start, because the start's already happened. You've missed it by the time you're even thinking about it. It's already, someone's already developed something. So it's never going to be perfect, I think, is probably the best way of saying any system that's brought in. In our mind, we sort of think, the 80-20 rule. If you can get 80% of people protected, you're doing a pretty good job.
Yeah, I agree. It's the well, I think it's a good question. What is good enough? I think the answer is perfect is the enemy of good, and all that sort of. You can't wait for it to be perfect. It does need to be. There needs to be a stage where you can say, well, that is good enough. That you should be doing that. You can't wait for things to be. Actually, they don't need to be perfect detection systems, but what they do need to be able to do is what are the consequences of detection? Because if the consequences of detection is automated detection and then human moderation, it doesn't need to be perfect because it's a step in a process. I think where it gets trickier is when you allow the machines to start making decisions that have real world consequences without any sort of human interaction, at which point the getting it wrong becomes has a real consequence and has an impact. So I would certainly say there's lots of really great, very good detection tools which are hugely useful for aiding human moderation processes, like filtering out the stuff you don't need to see and the things that you do need to see, but then before you take an action. But I would definitely be hesitant about any sort of system that allows the computer to make the final decision. And we have, you have seen examples where they've made the wrong decision that has caused some sort of real world harm.
Yeah. We have one final question, which just came in. Circling back to what Fred said earlier, some of the digital systems are not as fancy and efficient as they are advertised and marketed. Fred also talked about it's important to have that conversation with children, and that these businesses are here to make money. If the product is free, then you're the product. This makes me wonder if the conversation about digital or data literacy also includes business and marketing literacy. Yeah.
Not at the moment. I mean, it's the things with OfCom. It's as a regulator, you're quite limited for what you can and can't work on, because it has to be set out in the statutory books in regulation. So, but what we can do is we certainly encourage other folk to think about it. And I mentioned earlier the Digital Markets Unit, and this is the sort of thing they're thinking about, which is actually how can we truly educate people about the the motivations, the different business models. I mean, these are not companies that just build a widget. I'm a chartered director, so I work with the Institute of Directors a lot, and it's quite fascinating for me just to see how everything is design a widget, build a widget, ship a widget. It's the whole fundamental sort of build up to how business works is a little bit entrenched in last century, I would say. Absolutely agree that there needs to be more sort of business and marketing literacy going on. At the moment, it's certainly making a lot of people a lot of money selling straight into businesses, but it's fascinating to see some schools do seem to do this, depending on judging by the people that come through and have been employed at OfCom. It's clear that some people do understand the motivations behind it, but most people don't, and I think so it could be a gap in the education system generally. Or it could be something that we start seeing more and more people starting to pull together, maybe under something like there's something called the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, DRCF. That's the different regulators, and that's the sort of thing that we may well end up talking about in these sorts of fora.
Okay, great. We've reached the end of our session, so I want to thank you both again very much, Dan and Fred, for this really for your presentations, and I think this really fascinating discussion. Shauna, do you want to say anything, some final words, because Shauna has been responsible mainly for organizing this great event? So
just really to reiterate what you said, thank you to everyone who's participated and shared their work and the different ways that you're all tackling some of these issues, which are complicated, they're complex, they're not easily solved, and I think really need more joined up approaches. I think there's been some really interesting points raised about the different strategies that are taking place in different sectors, what we can learn from different sectors, and what we can learn from the different ways of coming together to address this. And yeah, just thank you for really interesting insights, and for all the participants, all the attendees. The questions that you put have been really thought-provoking. So I hope lots more future conversations will continue from this. And just you will probably have there'll be an email coming through from Eventbrite, but also stay in touch. You can follow the project on Twitter. It's @voice_digital. And the talks will be put up online again afterwards. So thank you, and do stay in touch. And yeah, have a nice evening.